Good morning, Internet. This is Tonal Discourse, your destination for all things music theory. This is a new podcast channel all about music theory. We're going to post a new episode every Tuesday, and we look forward to seeing you every week. My name is Seth Brown. I'm a composer and jazz trombonist.
My name is Graham Thomason. I'm a composer and jazz pianist.
And this is our very first episode. We're very excited about it. And our first topic of discussion is going to be something that a lot of people are really scared of. A lot of college students find it to be problematic to understand, and high schoolers especially. It's the concept of secondary dominant chords. They can be a little confusing, but hopefully today we're going to explain it in a really easy way to understand. So we're going to give this a go. First, before we get too far into this, Graham, can you explain what a dominant chord is first for our viewers that may not know?
Sure. A dominant chord is basically a chord that's built on the note that's a fifth above the note that we're trying to tonicize, which basically means the note that we're trying to get to. So if we want to get to a C major or minor chord, one of the clearest ways to do that is to use a G chord or a G7 chord. And all that is a major triad, sometimes with a flat 7, and that brings us to a C major or minor chord. And this works because it's built on the note that's a perfect fifth above C. So another example would be the way to get to a D major or minor chord would be A or A7 chord.
Now, just to be clear, when we refer to A7 or G7 or any dominant chord, when we say 7, we mean a major chord with a flat 7 added. So if we're in the key of C major, to make a G7 chord, which is the dominant chord in C major, then you would take G, B, D, and F, and it sounds like this. Now can you resolve it to C major?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that this works so well is because between the third and seventh note of the dominant chord contains a tritone, or a diminished fifth, or an augmented fourth, however you want to think of it. And this is perhaps the most unstable interval in our tuning system. It sounds like that. It's very dissonant, very grating, and it really wants to resolve. Graham, can you go ahead and resolve each of those in by half step? So it's very clear to our ears that this has a very strong pull to take us back to what we would consider home, to go back to our tonic chord, if you will. And this works both in major or minor. Can you go ahead and play that in minor as well?
Yes, and just so we know, in minor, so we're building a G7 chord. In the key of C minor, we have a B flat. So if we're writing this 5/7 chord in the key of C minor, we do actually need to change that B flat to a B natural to create a major third.
And just to be clear, we call that note the leading tone because it leads to our tonic. So now we're going to talk about a secondary dominant, which is a extension of the same idea. Now, this gets a little bit more chromatic, but it functions the exact same way that a dominant chord would. It's just a little different. Graham, can you explain the primary difference between a dominant chord and a secondary dominant chord?
Sure. So while a dominant chord tonicizes the home note of the key, so if we're in the key of C major, our dominant chord is G7 or just a G triad. And what that does is it pushes us towards the home note of the key, which is C. This works in C major or minor. In the case of, for example, D major or minor, the dominant chord would be A or A7. Now the difference here is that with a secondary dominant chord, we're tonicizing a note that's not the home note of the key. It's actually just a scale degree in the key. So going back to the example of C major, we could create a chord that tonicizes the third note of the key. And all that means is we're creating a chord that wants to go towards the third note. So what's the third note in C? It's an E minor chord, or the note E. And what we're doing is playing a chord that's the 5 or 5/7 of E, which is a chord that's built on a perfect fifth above E.
Right, and so this would be a B7 chord. So we could call this the secondary dominant of 3. It's a 5 of 3, a 5/7 of 3 is the way that you would most likely refer to this. So can you go ahead and demonstrate a 5/7 going to 1 in the key of C, and then a 5/7 going to 3 in the key of C?
Sure. So here's a 5/7 going to 1. It's G7 going to C. Now here's our third note in the key of C. Now here's what a 5-7, which is B7, going to the 3 sounds like in the key of C. So again, 5-7 to 1, and then 5-7 of 3 to 3.
Right, so we can see that even though it is increasingly more chromatic, the chord isn't exactly in the key, you have to alter some pitches to get there, but it's just as stable because you're creating the exact same fundamental system that you do with any other dominant chord. The next thing we would like to talk about is how do you write a secondary dominant chord, and we're also going to talk about which chords in a major or minor scale are actually tonicizable, because there's actually one scale degree that you can't tonicize in both major and minor.
Right, so the first thing is, how do we write these? And the thing with these secondary dominant chords is sometimes there's a scale degree that you're going to need to raise, and sometimes there's one that you're going to need to lower. It's not ever both, but depending on what note you're tonicizing in the key, you might need to raise or lower some notes. The first thing we do is find the note that's going to be the 5-7 of the note we're trying to tonicize. So if we're in the key of C again, and we're trying to tonicize the 6, which is A minor, what we do is we just go a fifth above A minor. So A, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it has to be a perfect fifth. And then we have this E. And what we need to do is build an E7 chord or an E major triad above that. So now let's say it's an E7 chord. It's E, G sharp, B, and D. And I know that because the G sharp is a major third above E, the B is a perfect fifth above E, and the D is a minor 7 above E. So anytime we create this 7 chord, this E7 chord, or any other secondary dominant, we need to keep these intervals the same. We need to have a major third, a perfect fifth, and a minor 7. And so in this case, I needed to actually raise this G to a G sharp in order to have a major third, because if we just use white keys, which are in the key of C, then we're going to have a minor third, but that doesn't allow us to create this 7 chord, this E7 chord, that allows us to go to A minor.
All right, that's awesome. So, Graham, can you please explain which chord in major and which chord in minor can't be temporarily tonicized? There's always going to be one in every major or minor key, and it's going to function under the same rule. It's going to be the same scale degree each time. So, Graham, can you explain that for us?
Sure. So in a major key, we have 5 other notes in addition to the home note of the key that can be tonicized, and the reason this is the case is because they're all major or minor triads. So I'm actually going to play some chords going up from the home note in the key of C, and then you're going to notice at the very end, one of them is going to sound different. Right, so that one sounds different. It's actually because it's not a major or minor triad, but it's a diminished triad. And because this is so unstable, we can't make it feel like home for even a short amount of time, which means we can't create a secondary dominant chord that leads to it well. And the same thing happens in a minor key, except instead of being on the 7th, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it's on the 2nd scale degree. So let's say we're in A minor, which shares all the same notes as C major. Then it sounds like this. Right, so it's the 2nd scale degree that can't be tonicized, but the rest can.
All right, thank you, Graham. So let's go ahead and review all the stuff that we learned today. This is going to basically wrap it up. We'll just do a quick review. So a secondary dominant chord is any chord that is a dominant chord where you can tonicize a chord other than 1. So a 5 of 1 we don't consider a secondary dominant. We just call it the dominant in the key. But if you need a secondary dominant, you are tonicizing a note that isn't 1. And the way that you do it is the exact same way. The way that you would write it is the same way of any dominant chord. You would create a major chord with a flat 7 or a minor 7. Sometimes you'll have to alter notes to make this work. But it works because it contains that tritone, which desperately so much needs to resolve to get back to its home base. So we learned what a secondary dominant chord is, we learned how they function, we learned which chords they can temporarily tonicize. Remember, in major, you can temporarily tonicize any chord except for 7. You can't tonicize the 7 chord of major. And then the same thing in minor. You can't tonicize the 2 chord. And the reason for that is because that chord contains a tritone, which is very unstable. It's a diminished chord, very unstable. You can't make that feel like home. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to see you next week.